I don't know if you've been following the Twitterverse, or TikTok for that matter. You shouldn't, by the way, especially on Twitter. Twitter is a toxic hellhole. I personally become an absolute dick when I'm on Twitter. I can't help it, it brings out the worst in me. Unfortunately, if you don't use the platform, you can't complain when those who do control the narrative. You know what I mean? So if you have been following on Twitter, you may have noticed the last couple of days the super straight meme. If you don't know what it is or where it comes from, you can blame this guy and this video for it.
I made a new sexuality now, actually. It's called super straight, okay? Since straight people, or straight men as myself, I get called transphobic because I wouldn't date a trans woman. You know, they're like, would you date a trans woman? I'm like, no, why? That's a female. No, like, that's not a real woman to me. Like, I want a real woman. No, you're just transphobic. So now, I'm super straight. I only date the opposite gender, women, that are born women. So you can't say I'm transphobic now because that's just my sexuality.
So yeah, that video went viral and boom, super straight was born. Now the trans community has obviously gotten really pissed off about it because they consider not being willing to date them to be a transphobic act, or non-act I suppose. Unfortunately, that's a rather aggressive idea, to be honest with you. To assume that someone's a bigot just because they won't date you or people like you. Especially when there are a lot of, unfortunately, very rational and reasonable reasons not to date a trans person. And that's sort of what I wanted to discuss here. I don't want to attack trans people because I don't think that's right. I think that genuine trans people, and I don't think that a lot of them are genuine, I'm sorry. I think a lot of people who identify as trans are just confused. But genuine trans people have a difficult life. So I'm not here to try and beat up on them. But as a straight guy who's not really fond of the idea of rape, I would like to discuss why we might not want to date a trans person. What the reasoning is behind it. Or some of the reasoning. And maybe just have the conversation in a mature enough way that nobody gets angry about it. Good luck with that one these days, eh? So let's get the most obvious reason out of the way first. If baby making were on my agenda, I would not date a trans person simply because that introduces too many variables to the possibility or likelihood of baby making taking place. I have testicles and a penis, and so therefore I need someone who has at least been born with compatible parts. That won't guarantee babies, but it would be a better plan than hoping that someone else born with testicles and a penis would ever be able to bear my young. Now, it's a fair point to say that I wouldn't be asking anybody on a first date or something like that whether or not they were fertile. And I don't assume, obviously, that every woman that I date is a potential baby mama. But there's still a lot of room for maybe there. And why would I lay for myself the trap of being with someone with whom I know that there is no long-term potential? And if you're trans, do you really want people to date you, knowing that they have no long-term interest in you? Now sure, not everybody wants babies, and these days it's becoming less and less common to have children. But once again, there's still the maybe. Maybe I don't want kids now, maybe I will later. Maybe my girlfriend doesn't want kids now. But maybe she'll change her mind. With a trans individual, there is no changing of the mind on that. And if you want children, you have to come up with another plan. You have to come up with an inorganic plan. And there's nothing wrong with an inorganic plan. I advocate for adoption. I think people should adopt. But not everybody wants to. And not everybody is going to be willing to date somebody that would add about 1,000 steps to the process of creating a family. So many trans people are pre-op, which means that they haven't yet undergone surgery to bring their physical sex into closer alignment with their gender. And many others will, at a later stage in their lives, choose to detransition, that is, to return to the gender that they formerly identified as. Now, what this means from a straight or a non-trans perspective, let me say, this means that they lack commitment to the identity or the gender by which they have come to define themselves. Or it means that a lot of really big, really disruptive changes are still on the horizon. Right, so if you haven't yet undergone the surgery, and it's a yet, you haven't yet, so you intend to undergo the surgery, You just haven't done it yet. That means at some point, your physiology is going to change from the person that I started dating to whatever it is that you wish to I don't want to say become, that seems rude, but you know what I mean. And on the other hand, even if you have undergone the surgery, that itself is no guarantee that you're going to remain the gender you are over the long haul. And these are pretty massive uncertainties to expect a group of people to just blindly accept. Because while I would stand by a partner through her hard times, it's unlikely that I'm going to seek out a partner who's actively planning to go through massive upheaval of her and, by implication, my life. These concerns might not make sense from a trans perspective, but as someone whose identity is rather fixed and has always been quite fixed to my physiology, it's a bit much to expect me to understand and entirely trust someone whose identity is unanchored from anything that I can recognize. Because a trans woman is not just a woman. You can't make that claim. A trans woman, we can identify trans women as women, but they're women of a particular psychological state. And that is something that should be taken into account when considering your dating pool. If you were to ask somebody who were allergic to dogs, for instance, if he wanted to date a woman who loved dogs, his default response might be, no, I don't. And that's what you're doing when you're asking if somebody would date a trans person. If you ask me if I would date a trans person, you are telling me something about that person other than just that she's a woman. And if you don't take that into account, you're not being reasonable. And let's be honest, relationships are already enough of a complication and a risk. Adding the trans prefix unfortunately only makes them more so. And on top of all of this, transgender activism has muddied the water so much that, fair or not to legitimate transgenders, transgenderism has become almost as much a political position as it is anything else, an oftentimes fanatical political position. So you have to sort of take the behavior of the activists into account when you're considering how somebody responds to the question. Because the activists have sort of tied sexuality to ideology, which is, it makes the whole thing that much more awkward, I'm sure, for everybody involved. According to Google and Wikipedia, because, let's be honest, that's about as much research as this particular question requires, heterosexuality is defined by sexual, not gendered attraction. The hint is in the word itself. You can gender bend all you want and invent all the genders that you want. And you can define yourself or label yourself according to one of hundreds of different gender categories. But as a sex, ultimately, you still fall into one of three broad groups. If you're pre-op or no-op, or one of four if you're post-op, just like the rest of us. And the fact is that as a heterosexual male, I am attracted to the female sex, not to an individual's feelings of being female. I have no point of reference as to what that means, and so it means almost nothing to me. The same logic, by the way, applies to homosexual people with regard to their respective male and female preferences. If you cannot handle that, then you are the slightly rapey bigot.
Trans women are women. So to say otherwise or to try to come up with a new label for your sexuality for being attracted to us would be othering and assuming that we are not real women when we are.
Oh, and just while we're on the topic of sexuality, guys, straight guys, if you want to have sex with a pre-op trans woman, there's a good chance, I would say, that you have at least some slightly homoerotic tendencies. And if you do, it would probably be far healthier for you to engage and confront those feelings for what they are, rather than using an almost fetishized form of trans acceptance as cover for what could well be a form of self-hating homophobia. When I talk about trans bigotry in this context, I'm not actually talking about bigotry against trans people, although I know that obviously exists. But what I'm talking about here is the sometimes wild-eyed fanaticism of trans activists. And the chances are, if someone's asking me if I would date a trans person, then they're an activist who probably self-identifies as trans, and is therefore probably either an abusive, a hate-filled bigot, or at best, a well-meaning simpleton, one outrage away from becoming an abusive, hate-filled bigot, because that's what a lot of modern activism seems to be about. And with trans activists specifically, a lot of it seems to be an outward manifestation of Western feminism's internal contradictions and its repressed hatred for women, in that it is a clear descendant of feminist thought, and its most tangible immediate outcome is the domination of the female sex and the dismissal of the male. And trans activists themselves are also tied to the broader army of pronoun people and sexual expression activists. Now remember, these are people who think that just because you do not perfectly epitomize the stereotypes associated with the masculine or the feminine, that means that you need to build an entire gender identity almost exclusive to yourself in order to accommodate your minor deviation from the norm. That is incredibly rigid, bigoted thinking that allows for very little individual expression of the nuances of the human experience. And ultimately, if I were to date a trans person, I would only do so under the understanding that her presence in my life is quite likely to invite that toxic activism into my life. And that is not something that very many people would find particularly attractive. Okay, so first off, the idea that a so-called irrational non-attraction to trans people is automatically bigoted is insanity. Sexual attraction is always irrational when viewed from any angle other than that of baby making. A woman can ruin a man's life and a man can end a woman's. Given the success rate of long-term relationships, they're a fool's errand, and yet most of us continue to irrationally engage in them anyway. So you cannot cite irrationality as an indication of bigotry in matters of love and fucking. And second, I'll be honest. If you asked me if I would date a trans person, I'll say no before any of the aforementioned reasonable or rational reasons enters my head. Because while I'll admit that there are a lot of trans women who can be just as, if not more, attractive and feminine than the next girl in line, the truth is that once I know the truth, an intangible element of maleness will have been introduced. It may not be fair and it may not be rational entirely, but I can almost guarantee that that would be a turn-off that would have me spending the rest of the relationship looking for an Adam's apple and hairy knuckles. She would never be able to relax, and nor would I. It doesn't sound like a relationship that either one of us would actually want to be in. And if I didn't know, that would simply mean that the relationship were built on a very fundamental lie. And that's kind of rapey. And that's not somebody that I would ever want to associate with, never mind date. Look, while I get ridiculously annoyed with mollycoddled activists of almost every sort, the sentiment behind trans accusations of bigotry often seem to be rooted in an element of insecurity. And for people who were born with a brain whose structure and function is legitimately at odds with the structure and function of their physiology, insecurity is to be expected. Hell, most of us got self-conscious when we started growing hair on our balls, okay? We can't even begin to imagine how it would have impacted our lives if our brains had insisted that we shouldn't have even had balls. So, I can't pass judgment on how insecure, nor am I here to mark a trans person for being insecure. That doesn't mean that we should all allow activists to get away with being bullies, because activists often are. But it does mean that we should try to push back against those activists without being completely insensitive to genuine trans people. People who are struggling, and who probably are not making anywhere near as much noise as those who claim to speak for them. And for any trans people who might be listening, try to understand where the reticence of both straight and homosexual people comes from. Trans activism has been used to silence voices, to abuse women, to take children away from their parents, to empower criminals, to hijack the LGBT movement, and to turn confused youngsters into aggressive mobs. Understandably, that's not a world most of us want to encourage, and while it might not be the world that you see, it's the world that we're shown, right? And you magnify that perception when you tell people that they have to include you in their list of potential sexual partners. I don't think it does you any good to treat people who won't sleep with you as though they were your enemies. Sex and love can be fun, they can be painful, they can be exciting, but they shouldn't be an obligation. And if you try to emotionally extort or blackmail people into dating you, how rewarding are those relationships anyway? Is that really what you want? To think that somebody's dating you simply because he's obliged, or she's obliged to, or they are obliged, whatever. Anyway, that's all I've really got to say on the topic. I hope nobody takes this as a call to action against anyone. I actually just want everyone to get along as much as is possible. If you like the content, you know what to do. Hit like, hit subscribe. There's a bell you should ring, apparently. I don't know. And then I'll catch up with you later. Cheers.